Today we're going to talk about how to incorporate and synthesize sources into a paper, and the most common assignment you'll run into would probably be a research-supported essay where you're asked to incorporate and synthesize multiple sources into your assignment so that you can show the reader that you have researched the topic, found important information, and you are sharing that important information with them by using it to support the points you're trying to make. So synthesizing sources, synthesis sounds like a big scary word, but we do actually use it quite frequently in various ways. So for example, the music industry uses synthesizing in a very similar way, but talking about music. So for example, if you think about a synthesizer, a machine that is putting multiple sounds together to create one song or one MP3 file for you to listen to. The concept is similar here, but you're doing it with writing. So the definition is that you're placing sources in conversation with one another. And other sources, for example, this quote from Hacker and Summers says, when you synthesize multiple sources in a research paper, you create a conversation about your research topic. You show readers that your points are based on your active analysis and integration of ideas, not just a list of quotations and paraphrases. Your synthesis will show how your sources relate to one another. One source may support, extend, or counter the ideas of another. So this is demonstrating the concept that you're going to be putting multiple sources in the same body paragraph, typically to support the same point that you're trying to make, and that it is okay if your sources don't agree with each other. Often you will use multiple sources that do agree or agree and extend with each other, so it goes into more detail, gives further support for the point that's being made. Occasionally, though, you may have two sources that disagree with each other, and both of them can be valid because we don't know everything in the universe, right? So there are things that we're trying to figure out, and oftentimes sources will have different reasonings behind observed phenomenon, etc. And they can both sound good. They can both be logical and from people with good credentials and good experience in the field. And so it's not always the best idea for you to say, I'm going to pick one that I think is right and not represent the other, because right now it may be that both of those sources are legitimate, and that is a primary conversation that's happening in the field, is that these two sources that disagree with each other are the two that are being worked out to try to figure out something that everyone can agree upon, right? So this goes beyond factual information, where people try to come up with explanations, reasonings for things, and so you can have two good sources or more good sources disagreeing with each other. So you may be wondering, how am I going to do that? This is actually in line with something most people are already familiar with, this concept that you need to have two things in academic body paragraphs. You need to have a topic sentence, which is the main point you are trying to make for that paragraph, and you need at least two supporting detail sentences. And in academic writing, usually paragraphs are longer than 3 sentences. Usually they're closer to 5 to 8 or even 10 sentences in length. Because you're trying to do so much in that paragraph, you may also need to transition, include explanation, have a concluding sentence to wrap up, etc. So this is just mirroring part of something you may already be familiar with. The structure is called PIE. And it's P-I-E, like the food, so it should be pretty easy to remember. And it's P for point, so that's that topic sentence, the main point that you're trying to make. I stands for information, which would be information from your sources that you're going to pull to support the point that you're trying to make. And then E is explanation, because you can't just throw facts and quotes into a paragraph without any explanation of what they mean and how they support the point that you're trying to make. So altogether, you get pi. So to start with here, point, it is the same concept that you should be familiar with, that you need a main point for each academic body paragraph, and that it's usually one sentence. It can be an implied topic sentence, although in academic writing, typically instructors want to see an actual sentence that they can point to say this is your main point, or that you can point to and say this is my main point. And it's typically located toward the beginning of the paragraph, but it can be anywhere. It's at the beginning of the paragraph usually because it signals to the reader, this is what's coming, this is what I'm trying to show you, so that when you get information from sources, it makes sense. The readers know what to do with it. So the P comes first, and then you have I, information from sources. And this is the information that you're going to bring in to your essay by quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing. And the types of information that you're looking for to bring in would be statistical data, so perhaps percentages that you want to share, expert testimony from professionals in the field, experts, people with good credentials, etc. Facts on the topic that you are writing about, expert observations, and a really big one for college writing would be research findings, because that is how we're trying to understand our world, is through research. And so if you can pull what is being found in research studies on the topic, that is very useful information for your reader. And this is also the information that, because it's coming from an outside source, you would need to cite that information with an APA in-text citation or whatever type of citation style you're assigned. And the last one here, explanation. You need to explain the source material because your reader hasn't read your sources. They don't know what information is in those sources, what those sources are about. Until you cite them, they don't know even what sources you've referred to. So they certainly don't know what that information means without some additional context and explanation from you. So typically, you'll need to explain what does this mean, or you'll need to provide the context, the setup for this information, some background information, and or you may also need to show how it connects back to the point that you're making in supporting or developing that point. So you may be wondering, why do I need to provide this explanation? Particularly if I'm using a fact. Isn't a fact, right? But in reality, no. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of contextual background information that's useful to the reader to understand exactly what you're trying to show. So if you gave a statistic, for example, to your reader and you just put it out there, they wouldn't know what that means. They wouldn't know what to do with it. They wouldn't know how it supports the point you're trying to make. So I'll give you an example. Let's say the statistic is that humans share 76% of their DNA with fruit flies, which is interesting. Okay, but what does that mean, right? So what am I supposed to do with this information? And if you have made a point, the point you're trying to make may be, for example, that everything that we found so far on the Earth comes from the same ancient ancestor, so we all have the same DNA. Okay, that helps a little, but really, so what's your point? 76%, is that a lot? Is that a little? What am I supposed to be doing with this? And I'll give you a morbid example here. So let's say a city experienced 50 homicides in the year 2013. You, as a reader, without any information, would be like, okay, is that good? Is that bad? Was the policing method that was used that led to this statistic, was it effective? Was it ineffective? What are you trying to show? And it depends on the context and your explanation to the reader of what it means. So, for example, if 50 homicides occurred in 1 year from my hometown, that would basically have been the apocalypse, and it would have been very, very bad. So my hometown only has about 10,000 people, and if 50 homicides occurred in 1 year, that means that 1 in every 200 people would have been killed, and so everybody in that town would have been directly affected. But if you live in Chicago, Illinois, which has a population of around 3 million people, 50 homicides isn't that bad. Yes, I know all homicides are bad, right? But then we're talking about 1 in every 60,000 people being affected. So the real context is that Chicago experiences nearly 500 homicides every year or more, depending on the year. So a drop to only 50 homicides in 1 year would be amazingly good. And if Chicago experienced something like that, whatever they did, whatever they changed, every other city in the US would want to copy them because that is so amazingly good. So not only do your readers need the actual factual number, but they also need some context, they need some background information, and they need an idea of how to interpret that information along with the point that you're making. So let's go back to the beginning here, and we're going to figure out a main point, how to figure out a main point, and then I'm going to take you through some examples of how to build a paragraph using information from multiple sources. So the main point must directly relate back to your paper's thesis statement. So for example, you might start with a research question in order to get your thesis statement, right? So your research question might be, how does nurse understaffing affect nursing home facilities? And if you can answer that question, you can write a paper about it. So your thesis statement can be the answer to your research question, but note the thesis statement itself cannot be a question, just like the main point, the topic sentence of each paragraph needs to be a sentence, not a question. So thesis statement for this pretend paper, we're going to be writing the understaffing of nurses at nursing home facilities endangers patients and nurses. So that is the thesis statement. That's what we're going to focus on. So everything in the paper has to be about how understaffing endangers patients and nurses. One of the main points could be that nurses are acutely aware that understaffing presents dangers to patients. And if you're going to use that as your main point for your paragraph, you will need to then support it with information from sources. So you may be wondering, how did you come up with that main point? Well, there are a few different ways that you can figure out how to write what main points you should be using. So first of all, if you're familiar enough with your topic before researching that you know what points you want to make, you can plan ahead before you even start researching what you want to talk about. But be open to finding new things in research that you might later decide, oh, I want to include a paragraph about this as well. Second option, if you don't know too much or really anything about your topic, you can do some basic preliminary research where you're just going through looking at what people are writing about in that topic, what people are researching and studying. And you can figure out, are there important points in that topic just from seeing what other people have researched and what they have studied. Another option would be to pick your sources or start picking your sources and then decide what important points you want to cover from those sources. So you need to use sources to support the points that you're making. So this is a direct way to then know what you can cover from your sources, right? What points they're talking about you could choose to talk about in your essay. And then usually what happens is you have to go out after doing a first round of research, do some additional research. You may also then find additional points to cover. Or the last option here would be to use some combination of the first three. I would say that's the most common, where people are at least a little familiar with their topic, so they know some points they want to make. They might do some preliminary research to see what points they want to make, and then also then find points from the sources they actually choose to use in their essay. And just a point of clarity here, that you cannot rewrite someone else's paper point for point or paragraph for paragraph or sentence for sentence. That is the whole purpose of synthesizing here, is that you're able to pull multiple sources together, use information from multiple sources to create your own source of truth with this essay that you're writing. So do not plan to just write the same points that another paper or article has chosen. You need to come up with your own. You can't just rewrite someone else's. So when you're pulling evidence from your sources, you want to look through the sources to find interesting facts, things that you might want to quote because they sound really good, or it would be difficult for you to summarize or paraphrase. And what you would want to do is highlight those, either physically printing out paper and highlighting, or using some kind of note-taking system on the computer. So for our example, we would need to look through sources that we found about understaffing of nurses at nursing homes and look for evidence of nurses being aware of the dangers to patients. So looking for statistics, expert testimony, research findings, examples, etc. And it's very important that you keep track of what information is coming from where. And even if you don't know how to use a citation style yet, you can still keep track. So for example, you can say this is source number 1, and then just put a 1 with that piece of information or that quote, so that it's always something you can go back and figure out how to cite it later. And just also a note that research can be difficult. It really depends on the topic and or the assignment and or your experience level. And the more that you practice researching, the better you'll get at it. But it is time consuming, so make sure you give yourself enough time. A good time to start researching for a paper, let's say a 5-page paper that's due on Thursday the 5th, you would not want to start writing that paper on Thursday the 5th. You would not want to start doing research the day before. It's something that you want to have time to really mull over and think on. So I would advise at least a few days ahead of time, the longer the better, where you can start researching, then read the sources that you're finding, decide which ones you want to use, throw out the ones that you don't want to use. Give yourself time to do a second round of research or more if needed, so that you're able to write your paper effectively. And just a note, research can be messy. So this is an example of my couch back in my graduate school days where I was writing a paper, and this was the end. When I was finally done writing the paper, I just had all my sources thrown onto the couch, and it was pretty cathartic to look at it and be like, I'm done. And obviously it's great if you don't have to use as many print sources, but it's very cathartic to be like, I'm done. I can throw away this article, or I can close the browser window on this article. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of paragraph examples here that goes through the process of how to build, including a topic sentence and source material from research that was conducted. So, giving you a heads up, there are multiple sources that are going to be used, and sometimes I'm going to use all of the sources of information. Sometimes I'm going to decide to cut back and only use 2, for example. And the sources are going to be color-coded so that you can see very clearly that there are multiple sources being used in the paragraph. And the APA and text citations are bold so that they pop out a little bit more and are easy to see. Okay, so doing some research on this topic, I found an article that provided a quote about a survey that was done. I found another quote about complaints being filed with the California Department of Public Health about near misses of injuries. And I found another source that gave a quote, again, about a survey. And this survey, I'm going to ultimately decide that I don't want to use it because it is too similar in nature to my first survey. And the first survey is actually better because it has a broader sample of nurses, and it is basically half of a state being surveyed, versus source number 3 is just one hospital being surveyed. Now, if I had time and energy and I wanted to, I could certainly use all 3 in my paragraph to support the point that I'm making. But if I don't want to include all 3, I can be picky and say I'm just going to choose these 2 to support my point. All right, so here is the end product of what came out. So the green sentence that's underlined is the topic sentence, the main point that we already had established, that nurses are acutely aware that understaffing presents dangers to patients. And then I have a source in blue that I left as a quote, so the wording is exactly word for word from the source. And then I have the second source being used in orange, and that is a paraphrase so that it's not too much quote in one paragraph, right? So typically the expectation is that you don't quote everything. So remember, paraphrase and summary are your best friends to avoid quoting everything. And everything that is black is explanation or context or helping to transition. So all the other stuff that I need to do in a paragraph to create a sense of flow and to make sure that my readers understand what's being said and how it ties back to the main point. So nurses are acutely aware that understaffing presents dangers to patients. Nurses who work every day directly with patients would know better than anyone else what kind of risks undercared for patients encounter. In a survey of Northern Massachusetts nurses, quote, 87% of nurses report having too many patients to care for, with 67% reporting an increase in medication errors, 64% reporting an increase in complications, and 54% reporting readmission of patients, all due to problems with understaffing. In text citation. If this survey is representative of the majority of nurses in the field, most recognize and are willing to report a correlation between patient overload and the inability to properly care for patients. Some nurses have gone so far as to report understaffing issues to overseeing medical organizations, such as the California Department of Public Health, because the potential for injury to patients from near misses. Facilities and organizations become aware of understaffing problems when nurses go through the proper channels to report real and potential injuries of patients. And so because of the color coding, you can see what's happening here. And if you want to color code your draft as you're working on it, that's fine. You can use bold, underline, color coding, etc. However, when you turn in the final draft, make sure that it's clean. All the text is black. You're not using underline and bold inappropriately, etc. So I'm going to show you another example here of how to build a source, and I'm going to show you in a little bit more detail why you need to provide that context and explanation and connecting material. Okay. So the topic sentence for this paper, totally different paper because it's a totally different topic. Bacteria are developing immunity to antibiotics and quickly outpacing medical advancements. So a source on that, this would be, I've already paraphrased it from the source. So our overuse of antibiotics, appropriate or not, causes the drug's ineffectiveness. Bacteria develop defense mechanisms to survive and thrive, even when exposed to medications designed to kill them. And then source number 2 in orange is a quote, and it is talking about antibiotic, the pipeline for creating new antibiotics not working because of 2 issues. So you might say, okay, those That's the bare minimum of what I need, right? That's my topic sentence. That is a supporting detail from one source and a supporting detail from another source. But I want to point out that if you just lump those together, it does not really make sense or flow very well without your help. So, to read it, bacteria are developing immunity to antibiotics and quickly outpacing medical advancements. Our use of antibiotics, appropriate or not, causes the drug's ineffectiveness. Bacteria develop defense mechanisms to survive and thrive, even when exposed to medications designed to kill them. Quote, simultaneously, the antibiotic pipeline is drying up for two reasons. One, it is intrinsically difficult to find new antibiotics with novel mechanisms of action. And two, a high cost-benefit and risk-benefit ratio discourage pharmaceutical companies from investment. So, there's no explanation of what the paraphrase in the quote means. There's no connection back to the point that you're trying to make. There's no transitioning, nothing. So it's choppy. Your readers might not understand why you're jumping from one thing to the next to the next. So after the topic sentence, I would want to add some context. So why do we care about this? This will help the reader understand why this is the point, why we're focusing on it, and transition to the first source that we're going to be using. After the first source is used, we're going to add a transition about why we're jumping from the immunity defense system to why there are no new antibiotic treatments. Then we'll jump to source number 2, and after source number 2, we're going to add explanation. So we're going to explain what this quote really means, because it's got, I wouldn't say terrible lingo or academic-ese, but it's a little much to expect someone to unpack everything that's being said. They'd have to sit there and really think about it, right? Especially if they don't have a business background for the last part. And then explain how it all ties back to the point that you're trying to make. And here's the finished product. Bacteria are developing immunity to antibiotics and quickly outpacing medical advancements. We depend on effective antibiotics to treat many different kinds of simple and tough bacterial infections. Even just our use of antibiotics, appropriate or not, causes the drug's ineffectiveness. Bacteria develop defense mechanisms to survive and thrive, even when exposed to medications designed to kill them. This natural immunity to antibiotics is compounded by a lack of interest in medical research to find new treatment options. Quote, simultaneously, the antibiotic pipeline is drying up for two reasons. One, it is intrinsically difficult to find new antibiotics with novel mechanisms of action. And two, a high cost-benefit and risk-benefit ratio discourage pharmaceutical companies from investment. End quote. Until consumers or companies are willing to meet the high cost and high risk of antibiotic development, we are in serious threat of going back to untreatable bacterial infections. All right, thank you for listening.